I woke to the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. My heart thundered as I turned toward the noise and froze. A massive figure loomed at the foot of my bed, its body smoldering, black flames licking at its twisted, skeletal frame. It tilted its head, and in a deep, guttural voice it growled, "You can't run. My name." It knew my name. The sound woke me first, a deep, scraping noise, like metal dragging against concrete. My eyes shot open, heart already pounding. But the room was silent except for the faint hum of the street lamp outside. I told myself it was nothing, just the house, settling, or a dream I couldn't quite remember. Across the floor, I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The noise was coming from the foot of my bed. I didn't want to look, but something, morbid curiosity or primal instinct, forced me to. That's when I saw it. A massive figure stood there, its frame hunched and skeletal, its body flickering with black flames right around it, leaving scorch marks in its wake. My breath caught in my throat as it turned its head toward me. Its eyes burned with a sick, orange light, and when it opened its mouth, whisper, "You can't run." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, like a death sentence. I wanted to scream, to move, but my body refused to obey. It tilted its head again. It embraced her hands and gripped him tighter, and I felt my chest tighten, as if the air had been stolen from the ground. Desperation took over. I lunged for the bedside lamp, my fingers fumbling for the switch. The room filled with harsh light, and when I turned back, it was gone. The smell of sulfur lingered. My floor was scarred with burn marks, and a faint trail of ash led out of the room. I stared at the marks, trembling. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it knew my name. When the sun finally came up, I told myself it had all been a vivid dream. Stress, maybe. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt hollow. When I pulled back the covers, my stomach dropped. The burn marks on the floor were still there, long, jagged streaks like something had clawed its way out. The faint smell of sulfur clung to the air, sharp and unmistakable. I forced myself to examine the room, hoping for an explanation. That's when I noticed the claw. Marks on my bedroom door, deep grooves carved into the wood. My hands trembled as I touched them. They were warm, almost as if the door had only just cooled from the heat. The edge of my bedsheet was singed, the fabric brittle under my fingertips. And on the windowsill, smeared like a warning, was a black, tar-like substance. It smelled acrid, like burning oil, and when I tried to wipe it away, it stuck to my fingers, leaving a greasy residue. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. The house felt wrong. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, thicker, like they were holding their breath. Once or twice, I swore I saw them move, just out of the corner of my eye. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched clung to me, heavy and oppressive. The faint warmth in the air, the scent of smoke that came and went. It was like the beast had left a piece of itself behind. As night fell, dread crept in, slow and suffocating. I closed every door, turned on every light, but it didn't help. I sat on my bed, staring at the burn marks on the floor, trying to convince myself it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was still out there, waiting. I stood in the kitchen, clutching a mug of tea, the soft glow of the stovetop light the only comfort. In the encroaching darkness, breath. I tried to focus on the steam curling up from the mug, letting its warmth anchor me. But then I heard it. That sound again. The scraping, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the hallway. My chest tightened as I set the mug down, the clang of ceramic against the counter feeling deafening in the stillness. The sound grew louder, heavier, as though whatever was making it was dragging something impossibly massive. I froze, my heart thudding in my ears. Then the kitchen lights flickered, plunging me into brief, suffocating darkness before flaring back on. And that's when I saw it. It stood in the doorway, towering and monstrous, its skeletal frame illuminated by its own black flames. Shadows remained. Liquid fire dripped from its claws, hissing and sizzling as it pooled on the Jano floor. The heat was unbearable, radiating from its body like a living furnace. My skin prickled as sweat trickled down my back. "You are marked," it growled, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "You belong to me." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me. I grabbed the nearest thing, a kitchen knife, and swung it wildly, my hands trembling. The blade passed through the beast-like smoke, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of sulfur. It didn't move. It didn't flinch. It just watched me, the flames in its body flickering in time with the pulse pounding in my ears. Wall. The wood hissed and blackened under its touch, the outline of its clawed fingers burning into the surface. Before I could react, it was gone. The air felt lighter, the silence deafening. But when I looked, down at my arm I saw it. Another mark, glowing faintly beneath my skin. Jagged lines. How? Spreading like cracks in stone. The beast had left, but I knew it wasn't gone. Not really. The next morning, I stared at the faintly glowing mark on my arm, the lines twisting and pulsing, as if they were alive. The memory of the beast's words, "You are marked. You belong to me," echoed in my mind, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a warning. It was a claim. I didn't want to face it alone. I needed someone, anyone, to believe me. I called my best friend, meeting them at a cafe under the pretense of catching up. But as soon as I rolled up my sleeve and showed them the mark, the words spilled out in a rush. I told them about the scraping sounds, the beast in the doorway, the black fire, burning handprint on my kitchen wall. They stared at me, wide-eyed, before laughing nervously. "You've been really stressed lately," they said, their voice careful. "Maybe you're dreaming, or seeing things?" "I'm not imagining this," I snapped, louder than I meant to. Heads turned at nearby tables, and I shrank into my seat. My friend reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. I knew that look, in their eyes. They didn't believe me. When I got home, I turned to the only thing I had left, the internet. I typed, search, beast with black fire, marked by a creature, burning handprints. Most of what I found felt like stories, folklore, urban legends about beings that marked their victims to claim their souls. Over the next few days, the mark on my arm began to spread. The jagged lines pulsed faintly, the heat beneath my skin growing stronger, as though the fire still burned inside me. I stopped. Trying to tell people, no one would believe me. The shadows in my home grew darker, thicker, and every creak of the floorboards sent spiraling. The beast wasn't gone. I could feel it, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for something, for me, and I couldn't escape it. The streets were unusually quiet as I walked home that evening, the air unnaturally still. The usual sounds of distant traffic and murmured conversations seemed muted, as though the city itself had stopped to listen. It wasn't until I reached the halfway point, between the cafe and my apartment, that I realized how heavy the air felt. Each breath came thick and slow, like I was inhaling smoke. Then I heard it. My name, low and guttural, carried on the wind. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse racing. The streetlights above flickered, casting jagged shadows across the pavement. I spun around, scanning the empty street, but there was no one there. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms as I tried to steady myself. "Your name," it came again, louder this time, reverberating through the stillness like a growl. My knees buckled, but I forced myself to stay upright. And then, just ahead of me, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the beast. The figure was human, barely, cloaked in dark fabric that seemed to ripple unnaturally in the dim light. They stood impossibly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Their face was obscured, but their presence felt old, ancient, and terrifyingly calm. "You've been chosen," the figure said, their voice as dry as the wind, cutting through the silence, like glass. "Beast has marked you. It feeds on guilt, regret, and fear. The more you give, the stronger it becomes." "Wait me," I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure tilted their head, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faint flicker of flames beneath her hood. It doesn't choose lightly. You carry something it wants, something it can feed on, until there's nothing left of you. I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me, but I didn't hit the ground. The figure seemed to shift. Closer, impossibly fast, until they were towering over me. The mark is a claim on your soul. It will not stop until you're gone, or until you sever the bond. How? The word came out in a gasp, desperate and pleading. The figure hesitated, their silence louder than any scream. Finally they spoke. To sever the connection, you must confront your deepest guilt and offer it as a sacrifice. Speak it aloud, accept it, and let it go. Only then will the beast be weakened. I felt a flicker of hope, faint and fleeting, but their next words crushed it. If you fail, the beast will not just take you, it will consume everything you've ever loved. The shadows around them began to ripple and twist, pulling the figure back into the darkness. Prepare yourself, they said, their voice fading. It will come for you soon. When they were gone, the silence returned, heavier than before. I staggered home, the weight of their words pressing down on me like a stone. Confront my guilt? Offer it as a sacrifice? The very thought sent a cold wave of dread coursing through me. But as I opened the door to my apartment, the air shifted again. I could feel it. The beast was already waiting. The basement felt colder than usual as I stepped inside, the faint hum of the overhead light doing little to dispel the oppressive darkness that clung to the walls. I carried the items the stranger had instructed me to gather: candles, chalk, and a small bag of salt. Blackened glass sat heavy in my pocket, its sharp edges pressing against my leg like a constant. The cell, reminder of what was to come. I drew the circle carefully, my hands shaking as I poured the salt in a steady line around me. The symbols came next, jagged marks etched into the concrete with trembling strokes of chalk. The air grew thicker with every step, the temperature rising until I could feel sweat beading on my face. The bruise spotted. I looked down at my face, my forehead. When everything was ready, I lit the candles, their flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. I stood in the center of the circle, clutching the shard of glass in one hand, and the stranger's instructions in the other. Ears, as I began to recite the incantation. The first words felt heavy on my tongue, like speaking them aloud was tearing something loose. Inside me, the air shifted, and the shadows along the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. Then, the heat came. It wasn't gradual. It hit me like a wave, stifling and choking, as though the room itself had been set ablaze. The beast appeared in the center of the room, its massive frame filling the space. Its body was larger now, its black fire burning brighter, more intense. The floor beneath it hissed and cracked as the flames spread, creeping dangerously close to the edge of the circle. You think this will stop me? It snarled, its voice a guttural roar that shook the walls. You cannot sever what is already part of you. I forced myself to keep going, reciting the words through clenched teeth. The beast roared, slamming its claws against the edge of the circle. The salt held, but just barely. The flames licked at the boundary, and I felt the heat sear my skin. Then it spoke again, softer this time, its voice cutting through me like a knife. Your guilt is mine. Let me show you. The memories came flooding back, vivid and raw. The moment I'd buried so deep, the thing I'd sworn never to speak of again. I saw it play out before me, as though it were happening all over. Again, the shame, the regret. It was unbearable. I faltered, the words dying on my tongue as the beast stepped closer. The circle flickered, the salt dissolving in the heat. I gripped the shard of glass tighter, my hand trembling. This was my only chance. I had to keep going. The flames around the room flared violently, licking at the edges of the salt circle I had drawn. The air was suffocating, thick with smoke and heat. My chest felt tight and every breath came as a struggle. The beast loomed before me, its ember-filled eyes blazing with fury. It towered over me, its skeletal frame crackling with black flames that seemed to burn hotter and brighter with every passing second. You cannot escape me, it growled, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. You cannot sever what you have already become. I gripped the shard of blackened glass tighter, my hands trembling as sweat dripped from my brow. The ritual was nearly complete, but the beast wasn't backing down. If anything, it was stronger now. It stepped forward, its massive claws leaving scorched marks on the ground as it entered the circle. The salt hissed and smoked, dissolving under the heat of its fire. The beast began to change, its form shifting and warping before my eyes. Its jagged, skeletal frame twisted into something horrifyingly familiar. My stomach churned as I realized what I was seeing. It was me, or at least a grotesque, burned version of myself. Its face was a charred reflection of my own, its ember-filled eyes staring at me with a mockery that cut deeper than any words. You carry the guilt of your choices, it hissed, stepping closer. Let me show you. The room shifted. Suddenly, I was standing in the middle of my worst memory, reliving the moment I had buried so deeply it felt like a distant dream. I saw myself, the choices I made, the people I'd hurt. The regret and shame crashed over me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The beast moved closer, feeding off my despair. Its flames grew brighter, hotter, as it whispered my own guilt back to me, word for word. I wanted to run, to scream, but I knew I couldn't. Was it? If I didn't confront this now, I would be lost forever. With shaking hands, I raised the shard of glass and spoke the words of the ritual. My voice cracked, the guilt clawing at my throat like a physical thing, but I kept going. I confessed everything, pouring my shame into the shard. The mark on my arm burned, flaring with the heat. It scratched my skin as I leaned toward her, so close. My breath caught. My cheeks turned red. Her eyes met mine, so intense I thought it might melt my skin. The beast roared, its ember eyes widening as the light from the shard grew brighter. Its flames flickered and sputtered, and its form began to crumble. No! It bellowed, its voice shaking the walls. You cannot undo this. I thrust the shard into the ground, completing the ritual. The room exploded in blinding light, and the beast let out a deafening roar as it dissolved into embers and smoke. The heat vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. The marks on my arm were gone, replaced by faint scars, but as I lay there, staring at the stillness around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Something still lingered, hidden in the shadows. When I woke up, the basement was silent. The air no longer smelled of sulfur, no longer burned my lungs with every breath, as though the beast had been nothing more than a nightmare. I stumbled upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, the weight of everything I'd seen and done pressing down on me. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. The light in my apartment felt brighter, the air clearer, but deep down, something didn't sit right. It wasn't relief I felt. It was the absence of, something, like a predator waiting, just out of sight, too patient for its own good. The signs began subtly, a shadow flickering across the wall when nothing was there, the faint smell of burning lingering in the corners of my apartment. I tried to ignore them, chalking them up to paranoia, but the feeling grew stronger. Every time I turned around, I felt like I'd just missed something, as if waiting for me to leave. Then came the whispers. Late one night as I lay in bed, I heard it, a faint crackling sound like a fire barely clinging to life, guttural, cutting through the darkness. It spoke my name, the same way it had before. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was silent again, but I didn't dare move. My eyes scanned the shadows, each one deeper than it should have been. For a second, I thought I saw something, a flicker of black flames at the edge of the room, but when I blinked, it was gone. I lay there until morning, my body rigid with fear, the whispers echoing in my mind. Over. It would never be over. If you dare, share my story. But remember, every retelling whispers your name into the darkness. Are you sure your shadows are empty? Or are they waiting just like mine? End quote. The The scratching started just as I was drifting off to sleep. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from under the bed. Before I could move, the noise stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. The night was unbearably still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel deafening. I was lying in bed, staring at the faint glow of my nightlight, cooling against the far wall. Sleep felt just out of reach, my mind restless and unfocused. I shifted under the covers, closing my eyes, willing myself to relax. And then I heard it, a faint scratching noise. At first I thought it was coming from outside, a stray branch brushing against the window, but it wasn't. The sound was closer, sharper, like nails dragging against wood, deliberate. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from under my bed. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. The noise continued, a slow, methodical scraping that sent chills racing down my spine. My mind raced to find a rational explanation. A rat? Maybe something caught under the bed? But the scratching was too precise, too deliberate, to belong to something mindless. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I strained my ears, listening for any hint of movement, any clue that I wasn't imagining this. That's when I heard it, a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close. I see you. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My heart slammed against my ribs, and my breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't my imagination. Someone, or something, was under my bed, and it was speaking to me. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as though the whisper had seeped into my muscles and locked me in place. The faint smell of damp wood and earth crept into my nostrils, mingling with the cold sweat on my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible so everything wouldn't be revealed later. And even though I knew I had to do it, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of the blankets. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head, trembling as I squeezed my eyes shut. My heart thudded in my ears, drowning out everything but the deafening silence that followed. I lay there, frozen, too scared to breathe, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The rest of the night passed in excruciating stillness. I didn't sleep, didn't move. When the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I finally worked up the courage to move. My hands shook as I lifted the blanket and leaned over the side of the bed, peering into the shadowy space. Below, it was empty, but the floor beneath the bed wasn't untouched. Jagged scratch marks cut deep into the wood, their edges splintered and raw, as if something sharp and deliberate had been carving them. There, real. I couldn't stop staring at the marks under my bed. They were deep, deliberate, each jagged line, a cruel reminder of what I'd heard the night before. I told myself it was a nightmare, a trick of a restless mind. But the scratches were real, and they weren't something I could explain away. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. In the house felt colder, the air heavier. By the time evening came, I avoided my bedroom entirely, the thought of stepping back inside making my chest tighten. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but it didn't help. It started with small things. The bed frame creaked faintly, as though something, or someone, was shifting underneath. Objects I was sure I'd left in one place seemed slightly moved. The edge of the shelf. At first I chalked it up to my own distraction, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. Every time I stepped into my bedroom, I felt it. The prickle at the back of my neck. The undeniable sensation of being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, heavier, as if they were stretching toward me when I wasn't looking. The air felt colder near the bed, the space underneath it shrouded in a suffocating stillness. While cleaning later that afternoon, I noticed something new. A small pile of wood shavings had been collected beneath the bed, their edges jagged and splintered. My heart sank as I crouched down to inspect them, my pulse quickening. That's when I saw it. A deep, fresh scratch running along the underside of the bed frame. Something with claws had been carving into the wood. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as panic set in. Whatever had been under my bed the night before wasn't gone. It hadn't left. It was still here. That night, I couldn't bear to go back into my bedroom. The memory of the scratching and the whispering voice kept playing over and over in my head. I stayed curled up on the couch, clutching a blanket around my shoulders, trying to convince myself it was all just stress or a vivid nightmare. The living room felt safer, brighter somehow, but as the hours ticked by, the silence, it pressed in, heavy and oppressive. Every creak of the house made me flinch. My nerves stretched to their breaking point. At around midnight, the air seemed to shift. It became colder, and an unsettling stillness filled the room. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. My skin prickled as if something unseen was watching me. I looked toward the hallway leading into my bedroom. The door was closed, but the darkness beyond it felt alive, pressing against the edges of the frame like it was trying to seep into the living room. I couldn't stay on the couch. I needed to check. I needed to prove to myself there was nothing to fear, shallow as I reached for the door handle. When I pushed the door open, the cold air hit me like a physical force. Then I remembered. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The room felt wrong, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Hesitated near the bed, staring at the dark space underneath. Then, it started again. The scratching. Louder, more erratic this time, as if whatever was beneath the bed was frantic to escape. Then I heard it. The voice, low, rasping, and sharper than before. You can't hide from me. The bed frame shook violently, the scratching growing deafening. My whole body trembled as I clutched the edge of the dresser for support. Against every instinct, I dropped to my knees, slowly lowering my head to look under the bed. The darkness seemed to move, pulsing as though alive. Then, a hand shot out. A pale, clawed hand that gripped the bed frame with a force that splintered the wood. The claws dug deep, dragging long, jagged lines down the frame. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I could only stare at the hand, my mind screaming at me to run. The hand twitched, and that was enough to break the spell. I stumbled to my feet and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, listening to the scratching that continued on the other side. It didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing under the bed was furious. I had escaped. I didn't go back into that room again that night. The next morning, I sat across from my best friend at a cafe, clutching my coffee cup like it was the only thing grounding me to reality. My hands trembled as I told them everything. The scratching, the whisper, the hand. I even showed them the fresh scratches on the floor and the splintered bed frame. My voice was shaking, and my eyes darted to every shadow in the room, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. My friend listened, their expression wavering between concern and disbelief. You've been under a lot of stress, they said carefully, trying to sound reassuring. Maybe you're just imagining things. Nightmares can feel really real, especially if you're anxious. It's not stress, I snapped, louder than I intended. A few people glanced in our direction, and I shrank back, lowering my voice. I recorded it. There's something under my bed. I'll show you. That night, I set up my phone on a chair, angling it to capture the entire bed. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Just when I thought nothing would happen, it began. The sound was faint at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder, more frantic. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, too terrified to look, even as I heard the bed frame creak under the weight of something moving beneath me. In the morning, I reviewed the footage. At first, it seemed normal, just me tossing and turning, the room quiet. Then, at around 3 a.m., the scratching began. The camera picked up faint whispers, too low to make out clearly. And then, there it was, a clawed hand sliding out from under the bed, reaching toward me before retreating into the shadows. My stomach churned as I showed the video to my friend. Their reaction crushed me. They laughed nervously, shaking their head. "This is good," they said, their voice wavering. "Like, really good editing. You should do special effects or something." "It's real," I shouted, my voice cracking. They didn't believe me. No one would. I left the cafe, feeling more alone than ever, the weight of the footage burning in my pocket. That night, as I sat on the couch, the scratching began again, louder this time, closer. I wasn't imagining this. It was real, and I was alone. I couldn't ignore the scratching anymore. It wasn't random. It wasn't mindless. It was purposeful, deliberate, like it was trying to tell me something. After showing the video to my friend and being dismissed, I realized no one would help me. I was alone in this. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet. I spent hours scrolling through obscure forums, typing things like scratching under the bed, creatures in the dark, and haunted voices. Most of what I'd found seemed laughable. Ghost stories, fictional accounts, cryptid sightings that felt too ridiculous to be true. But one thread caught my attention. It was titled, "The Sleeper Below." The post described a creature that didn't just haunt. It waited. It fed on fear and secrets, its power growing as its victims unraveled. My stomach tightened as I read stories that felt too close to my own. The scratching, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. One user's words stuck with me. "It doesn't just want you scared. It wants you broken." Before I could close the page, a private message appeared on my screen. The sender's username was a string of random letters and numbers. The message read, "You're not imagining it. It's real. And it's not just haunting you. It's waiting for you to break. It feeds on fear and secrets. If you want to survive, you have to confess. Tell the truth. It won't lead until you." I stared at the screen, my chest tight. Confess? To what? My mind raced through the past. Keeping track of memories was difficult. At night, describing my past without precedent was much harder. It all boiled down to that last, dredging up memories I'd buried long ago. Was this about the lie I told? The choice I made that hurt someone I cared about? The guilt I thought I'd moved past? That night, the beast's presence was undeniable. The scratching turned to loud, deliberate thumps, thick and stifling, and the shadows on the walls seemed alive, writhing and pulsing with a rhythm that matched the thudding beneath the bed. I turned on the light, hoping to make it stop, but what I saw froze me in place. Deep claw marks had been gouged into the wall above the bed, jagged and uneven. The word etched into the plaster, "Confess." It wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. The message replayed in my mind over and over. It feeds on fear and secrets. Confess. I didn't know if it was real, but I was out of options. I couldn't keep living like this. The beast was getting stronger. I could feel it. Its presence heavier, its whispers louder, its scratches deeper. The stranger from the forum sent me instructions. A ritual. They claimed it could sever the connection, weakening the beast enough to make it leave. It sounded ridiculous, but I had nothing left to lose. I followed the steps exactly. Candles arranged in a circle, symbols drawn, candles written, as if by an adult, with chalk a line of salt around me to keep the beast at bay. As I lit the last candle, the air in the room changed. It grew icy, and the light seemed to dim, swallowed by the shadows gathering in the corners. The scratching started again, slow and deliberate, but this time, it wasn't under the bed. It was everywhere, above me, behind me, inside the walls. Then the whispers began, layered and guttural, overlapping until they filled the I forced myself to start the incantation, my voice trembling as I spoke the unfamiliar words. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and the whispers turned to roars. My heart pounded as the shadows coalesced, pulling together until the beast emerged. It was taller than I'd imagined, its skeletal frame twisted and jagged, black, clawed hands scraped against the floor as it stepped closer. Its ember-filled eyes locked onto me. It stopped, just short of the salt circle, its presence so overwhelming I could hardly breathe. "Confess," it snarled, its voice shaking the walls. Tears streamed down my face as I forced the words out. confessing the guilt I'd carried for years. Every word felt like a knife slicing through me, raw and unforgiving. The beast roared, its form flickering, but it didn't back away. With trembling hands, I finished the incantation, pouring my guilt into the words. The beast lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air, but the salt circle held. Its body convulsed, the shadows writhing as it dissolved into smoke. One final roar filled the room, and then it was gone. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my arm burning where its claws had grazed me. A jagged scar ran across my skin, a permanent reminder of what I'd faced. The room was silent, but I knew this wasn't the end. Something still lingered, just out of reach, waiting. For the first time in what felt like weeks, my house was silent. The claw marks on the walls were gone, erased as though they had never existed. The oppressive cold that had haunted every room had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. The air felt lighter, breathable, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. I had faced the beast, confessed my guilt, and survived. It had to mean something, but the scar in my arm still burned. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal. I cleaned my room, moved my bed, rearranged my furniture, anything to make the space feel less haunted. Being watched lingered, a faint prickle on the back of my neck whenever I sat alone. Shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, their edges moving ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was the nights that were the worst. The silence, once comforting, now felt like it was waiting for something. Some nights, I thought I heard faint scratching, too soft to be sure, like nails, tapping just out of reach. I told myself it was my imagination, but my chest tightened with every sound. Then, one night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. That voice. Low, guttural, and unmistakable, it whispered from the darkness. I'm still here. My breath caught, and the blanket slipped from my fingers. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes darted to the edge of the bed, and for a split second I thought I saw a flicker of movement. A pale claw retreating into the shadows beneath me. I lay frozen, every muscle locked in place. As the silence crept back into the room, it felt heavier, now suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I knew then that it wasn't over. It would never be over. If you dare, share my story. But remember, every retelling whispers your name into the dark. Are you ready to risk it? Are you sure your bed is empty? Or is he already waiting for you underneath? He is waiting for you up there.